The names you just saw may be familiar to you. Each one of them is a known murderer. What you may not know is that every one of them tortured and killed animals at some point in their lives. In interviews with mass murderers, nearly 100% had abused and killed animals. Most had a history of fire setting. In a survey of battered women, 82% said their attacker had threatened family pets. 69% said their significant other had killed a pet. Individually, these can sound like random statistics until you learn about the link running between them all, a link that can be broken. Here in Aurora, there is an organization that provides information and support for agencies involved in handling these crimes. It is called The Link. During this presentation, we're going to give you a brief overview of the link between events like child abuse, domestic violence, animal abuse, arson, and murder, and hopefully provide you and your colleagues with the background and knowledge to recognize and even break this tragic chain of events.
911.
I see smoke coming out of my neighbor's garage. There was a lot of yelling before, and now it's worse than it's ever been. Please hurry.
2 prior domestics from that residence and an animal cruelty within the last 6 months.
Got a party in a blue shirt, white shorts, getting into a white truck. Run inside the house, run inside the house. Definitely got smoke coming from the house.
I have 3 parties down, probably DOA.
Thomas Stark, under arrest for the murder of his wife and 2 children. This is the awful conclusion to years of escalating violence. He began here as a typical little boy. So what happened? What were the links in his journey from innocent youngster to killer?
Children who have witnessed domestic violence, children who have experienced violence firsthand are obviously at much higher risk of perpetuating that cycle of violence. And not just as true victims, but even as witnesses, they are more likely to become either perpetrators themselves or victims themselves. Again, you get into the cycle of somehow thinking that it is normal to hurt the ones you love, to be hurt by the ones you love.
No! I told you to pick up your damn toy! Be quiet! I don't want to hear another sound out of this room.
What happened? What did you do?
I'm just trying to teach him a lesson.
No, not again.
Look, I'll take care of this. I'll handle it. If you don't like it, I'll teach you the same lesson.
Many violent perpetrators were first exposed to violence in their own homes, either as victims of verbal, physical, or sexual abuse, or seeing harm done to family members or beloved pets. Sarah's husband grew up in a household where verbal and physical abuse were common.
His father was very abusive to him, to his brothers and sister, and to his mother. He was very hard and harsh type of a person to them. For instance, there was one time when he didn't clean up all the stuff in the backyard from one of the dogs, and his dad took him out and shoved his face into it and beat him up a little bit and told him he needed to do a better job, more or less. And that's the kind of life he grew up with.
We see that probably in about 1/3 of the cases where there has been a child victim or child witness, the way they show their acting out behavior is through violence against an animal. And it's natural. When children play school, they want to play teacher or principal. They want to be in a position of power. When children play abuse, they play abuser. They want to be in the position of power. And the only victim available to a small child that is playing abuser is a smaller child or an infant or a pet.
What did you do to him? Just kicked him a few times. Didn't take much. What are you gonna do now? Let's see how he likes this.
There is compelling evidence showing that people who commit multiple murders share a common history of torturing and killing animals. Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, trapped dogs and cats in orange crates and shot arrows through the boxes. Jeffrey Dahmer impaled frogs, cats, and the heads of dogs in his backyard. Too often, animal abuse is viewed as just boys being boys, but it can be a reliable predictor of future violence.
When it comes to children, some people think it's okay for kids to abuse animals, even if it's minor, whether it's cutting off the whiskers, picking it up by its tail, hitting it, kicking it, those kinds of things. A lot of people think that's minor, but it's really not. Those are all signs that that kid should be evaluated. It's not normal for a child to hurt a living thing. I did have a child one time. He was about, I think he was 10 years old. He used to put his 2 cats in his drawers in his dresser and leave them there and torment them and terrorize them in his room and chasing them around with a vacuum hose until finally one day he started beating them, and he beat them so bad one of them suffered a very severe head injury and had to be euthanized.
If that gives them satisfaction, if they gain a sense of power and control through inflicting suffering and death on other living things, and it has no consequences for them other than to make them feel more empowered and feel better, that really is the start of a very vicious, deadly cycle.
Sarah doesn't know if her husband abused animals as a child, but he saw his father abuse animals, and she saw her husband abuse animals during their marriage.
Whenever he'd scream and yell, the dogs would go and cower into a corner, and we're talking 65-pound dogs, both of them. And they'd go and cower, and then he'd go and scream at them because they were doing something wrong. They were in the corner, or they were in his way, or what have you, and if they weren't moving fast enough, of course, he'd strike out at them and hit them. There was a couple of times I think he broke the dog's ribs.
Children who injure, torture, and kill animals may start to look for other victims, striking out against humans as well, forging a link between abusing animals and hurting people.
After tormenting and targeting animals, you see kids start to move toward other kids, more vulnerable kids, sometimes even handicapped kids. So again, they want to target those that are most vulnerable.
From preteen years into the early teens, this behavior usually takes the form of bullying, with a child picking on students he perceives as weaker than himself.
Kids bully to gain a sense of power. They do this in the sense like sort of radar. They're looking for vulnerable spots on other kids. So that they're trying to push their buttons and get them emotionally aroused so that then they can demonstrate their power by getting them to back down emotionally and or physically.
Hey kid, give me some money. You're a liar. You're a liar.
Please help me.
You're a liar.
Please.
You're worthless.
Please don't.
I'll be back and you better have some money.
Get away from me.
Dr. Porter says bullying can vary by age and sex. In elementary schools, it's often an individual act. As kids get older, say middle school aged, it becomes a group act, with a bully often surrounding himself with followers to go after a victim. For girls, bullying usually takes the form of social alienation, while boys use verbal and physical harassment. Dr. Porter says some kids bully because they are bullied at home by siblings or parents. Others spend little time with adults and get little adult guidance on right and wrong. And early bullying is a strong indicator of future problems.
Well, the research is very clear that kids identified at age 8, over 65% of them, by the time they're 24, end up in the correctional system.
The crimes committed by bullies later in life still involve that sense of control and can range from a con artist to someone committing domestic violence.
To me, he was very controlling. For almost 2 years, I couldn't get out of the house to go get a job because he would literally mess up the car, so I couldn't make it for an interview. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere unless he knew where I was going and who I was going to be with, and even then he questioned me 9 million times, it seemed like.
We'll show you more on that link to domestic violence in a minute. But first, another early indicator that a child is becoming increasingly violent. Many kids play with fire, and all too often it's also written off as just a stage kids go through. But such dismissive statements can be very dangerous. Fire is another way troubled kids act out, another link in a chain of violence.
I recall one fire we had that was in a garage that had been converted into a shop with a living space above the shop. And a young boy in this family had a history of run-ins with the law, fights, trouble at school, And it escalated to the point where, in order to act out toward his mother, he started a fire in the shop where some animals, rabbits, were kept in cages. And so he purposefully set a fire, and he purposefully made sure that the animals were in their cages in this garage. Arson is a violent crime. Fire is a weapon, and it's a weapon that's available to these kids.
FBI figures show more than half the people arrested for arson in the year 2000 were juveniles. A troubled teen may be setting a fire for the thrill of watching something burn, or to destroy something valued by a person who has hurt him, to feel a sense of power, or to cover up another crime, such as animal abuse. Another, more direct way these crimes can be linked.
You see this escalation in violence that begins with these childish things that are available to them, fire setting, childish forms of violence, and then they escalate on. Animal abuse escalates into human violence that we see older gang members who use incendiary devices to lash out and attack their enemies, and then they move into guns and assaults. So yes, we see a lot of kids who go from the crime of arson and fire setting as juveniles into serious violent acts as adults.
As violent acts of animal abuse, bullying, and arson become more commonplace, perpetrators often look for new thrills or new people to control and dominate. Violence has become a part of their lives, a key outlet for expressing their anger, frustration, and need for control. Another link is added when, as before, they strike out at those around them.
Chicken? Told you, I don't want chicken anymore.
But the chicken was on sale and you
Are you arguing with me? I've told you to never argue with me again.
Sorry.
I'll teach you to argue with me.
There was other instances too where he's grabbed me by my neck and shoved me against the wall and told me to shut up, or it was his way, and you know, that things like that I better do it as he wants it done, and to shut up or never mention that again, or it's none of my business type stuff.
The links are clear between a past history of animal abuse and later incidents of domestic violence. In fact, the two can go hand in hand, with many abusers using animals as a way of controlling their partners.
He told me that if I left, he was going to kill my animals, that I wouldn't be able to take them with him, and that, of course, I wouldn't be able to have his. And he'd kill his before I was able to take them anywhere. He'd make sure of that. So basically, he said that he'd kill all the animals.
The animals are oftentimes killed, tortured, maimed, in an attempt to control the victim, to prevent them from leaving, or to punish the victim if they have in fact left, or to try to force their return. There was a woman in Utah who went to shelter. She was doing well in shelter. She was on target, she was making strides, she was getting ready to be independent out on her own. And she went to her counselor one day in tears, and she had in her hand a letter that had been sent to her mother from the batterer. And contained in the letter were photographs of him cutting the ears off her dog. And she said, I have to go. I have to go back home. He's going to kill my pets. He's going to kill the farm animals. This was a rural area. They did everything they could to try to convince her not to return, understanding then the lethality, but she went home. So it is not uncommon that a batterer will harm an animal to punish the victim for leaving or to coerce her into coming back.
The scene of a domestic violence incident may include signs that there are multiple victims in the house, such as children and pets, in addition to an adult partner.
That's one of the reasons we think that any response to domestic violence really has to also pay close attention to all the victims in the family, and has to have as a long-term goal breaking that whole cycle of familial violence.
Each of these links may be evident in a person's history, or perhaps just a link or two. They may evolve over many years or escalate quickly, but all too often, a perpetrator who continues this far relatively unchecked eventually progresses to murder. He may commit a series of heinous acts, such as Jeffrey Dahmer, or commit one horrible act against his family, just as Sarah says her husband has threatened to do to her.
He came up to the kitchen and he says, I'm just going to go get my stuff. He goes, and I'll take care of him, meaning my son. And he says, and I'll take care of that other, and I'm not going to say what he called him, but that's another kid that lives with us. He says, and then when your daughter comes home, she's done too. He says, and then when I'm all done with that, he goes, I'll just take care of you too. He says, and then I won't have any more problems. Then the house will be mine, the animals will be mine, and I just won't have any more problems.
So you've seen the development from victim to abuser to killer, the links between one violent act and another. What if this child's family had received effective counseling? The cycle of violence may have stopped there and not been carried on by the child. What if the child who injured this animal had received evaluation and treatment? What if authorities knew about the family violence in his background? Maybe the child could have learned better coping methods and the animal could have been spared. What if authorities investigating this arson knew about the perpetrator's history? There could have been more intensive evaluation, more thorough intervention. What if the different agencies involved could get a more complete picture thanks to cooperation between agencies and shared information? What if the link could be recognized and broken? Out there right now are many people who have the potential to become violent offenders, even killers. You as professionals are being challenged to look for and identify the links that lead from one crime to another. The smallest acts of violence against animals or people must not be ignored. We've seen where they can lead.
I am scared. I'm scared that he's going to come out of somewhere, sometime, somehow, and just get me and disappear, and nobody will ever get him. I'm scared that's what's going to happen.